There's an old saying in the business school that you should focus on what you're good at, and you should simplify your product lines, and you should get rid of product lines that don't work. Intel famously had the term is called ARM. It's a RISC chip. And this particular RISC chip was not compatible with the architecture that they were using for most of their products. And so they sold it. Unfortunately, this was a terrible mistake because the architecture that they sold off was needed for mobile phones with low memory, with small batteries and heat problems and so forth and so on. And so that decision, that fateful decision now 15 years ago, meant that they were never a player in the mobile space. And once they made that decision, they tried to take their expensive and complex chips, and they kept trying to make cheaper and smaller versions. But the core decision, which was to simplified to the wrong outcome. Today, if you look at, I'll give you an example, the NVIDIA chips use an ARM CPU and then these two powerful GPUs. It's called the B200. They don't use the Intel chip. They use the ARM chip because it was, for their needs, faster. I would never have predicted that 15 years ago. So at the end, maybe it was just a mistake, but maybe they didn't understand in the way they were organized as a corporation that ultimately battery power would be as important as computing power, right? The amount of battery you use. And that was the discriminant. So one way to think about it is if you're going to have these sort of simple rules, you better have a model of what happens in the next 5 years. So the way I teach this is just write down what it'll look like in 5 years. Just try.
What will look like in 5 years? Your company? Or
whatever it is, right? So let's talk about AI. What will be true in 5 years?
That it's going to be a lot smarter than it is now.
It'll be a lot smarter. But how many companies will there be in AI? Will there be 5 or 5,000 or 50,000?
50,000?
How many big companies will there be? Will there be new companies? What will they do? Right. Mm-hmm. So I just told you my view is that eventually you and I will have our own AI assistant, which is a polymath, which is incredibly smart, which helps us guide through the information overload that it is today. Who's going to build it? Make a prediction. What kind of hardware will it be on? Make a prediction. How fast will the networks be? Make a prediction. Write all these things down and then have a discussion about what to do. Startups wiggle. They try something else, and they're very quick to discard an old idea. Corporations spend years with a belief system that is factually false, and they don't actually change their opinion until after they've lost all the contracts. And if you go back, all the signs were there. Nobody wanted to talk to them. Nobody cared about the product, right? And yet they kept pushing it. So if you're a CEO of a larger company, what you want to do is basically figure out how to measure this innovation so that you don't waste a lot of time. Bill Gates had a saying a long time ago, which was that the most important thing to do is to fail fast, right? That and from his perspective as the CEO of Microsoft, founder of Microsoft, that he wanted everything to happen and he wanted it to fail quickly. And that was his theory.
And do you agree with that theory?
Yeah, I do. Fast failure is important because you can say it in a nicer way, but fundamentally, at Google, we had this 70-20-10 rule that Larry and Sergey came up with. 70% of the core business, 20% on adjacent business, and 10% on other.
What does that mean, sorry?
Adjacent core business means search, ads. Adjacent business means something that you're trying, like a cloud business or so forth. And the 10% is some new idea. So Google created this thing called Google X. The first product it built was called Google Brain, which was one of the first machine learning architectures. This actually precedes DeepMind. Google Brain was used to power the AI system. Google Brain's team of 10 or 15 people generated 10, 20, 30, 40 billion dollars of extra profits over a decade. So that pays for a lot of failures, right? Then they had a whole bunch of other ideas that seemed very interesting to me that didn't happen for one or another, and they would cancel them. And and then the people would get reconfigured. And one of the great things about Silicon Valley is it's possible to spend a few years on a really bad idea and get canceled, if you will, and then get another job having learned all of that. My joke is the best CFO is one who's just gone bankrupt, because the one thing that CFO is not going to let happen is to go bankrupt again.
Yeah. How do you think about competition? For everyone that's building something, how much should we be focusing on our competition?
I strongly recommend not focusing on competition and instead focusing on building a product that no one else has. And you say, well, how can you do that without knowing the competition? Well, if you study the competition, you're wasting your time. Try to solve the problem in a new way and do it in a way where the customers are delighted. Running Google, we seldom looked at what our competitors were doing. What we did, we spent an awful lot of time was what is possible for us to do? What can we actually do from our current situation? And sort of the running ahead of everybody turns out to be really important.
What about deadlines?
Well, Larry established the principle of OKRs, which were objectives and key results. And every quarter, Larry would actually write down all the metrics, and he was tough. And he would say that if you got to 70% of my numbers, that was good. And then we would grade based on, are you above the 70% or are you below the 70%? And it was harsh, and it worked. You have to measure to get things done in a big corporation. Otherwise, everyone kind of looks good, makes all sorts of claims, feels good about themselves, but it doesn't have an impact.